Good day, dear students. I'm welcoming you here at our class today, and we're going to study the Federal Reserve System and the financial crisis and how they worked in the world financial crisis of 2008-2010. That was a really serious issue, and the question of how they dealt with the crisis is really important for us. I'm going to do the overview of the lectures, and these lectures we're going to have a series of 4 lectures on the Federal Reserve and the financial system of the world and how it works. These lectures review some of the causes and policy responses of the Federal Reserve to the world financial crisis, the way it started, its actions in 2008. Then, of course, we're going to understand the role of the Federal Reserve System and the way it worked in the past as well. We're going to find out the origins of the United States Federal Reserve System. In 1913, it started in 1913. Then, of course, we're going to study some of the very important instruments of the macroeconomic policy in those days. And, of course, we're going to try to understand the workings of the world financial system in the early 20th century and at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Some of the decisions of the Fed, etc. So, the lessons of previous financial crises and how they informed the Fed's decisions in the recent one. In lecture 1, we're going to study what central banks do, how they worked in the past. We're going to understand and learn the origins of the Federal Reserve System in the United States, the origin of central banking in the United States, and of course the Great Depression as well. We're going to speak about that as well. And in lecture 2, we're going to review the developments in central banking after World War II, focusing on the recent financial crisis. In lecture 3, we're going to describe the financial crisis, the recent financial crisis, its implications, the banking crisis, the collapses of many institutions, of banking institutions, banking corporations, things like that. In lecture 4, we're going to discuss monetary policy responses to the recession, the sluggish recovery, post-crisis changes in financial regulation, and implications of the crisis for central bank practice. So, lecture 1. This is going to be for today. In lecture 1, we're going to study the origins and mission of the Federal Reserve System. What is a central bank? Well, a central bank actually is a government institution, and this is really important to understand. It is not a private corporation. There are commercial banks in the system and the central bank which governs this financial system. The financial system and the monetary system of any country is heavily dependent on its monetary system, on the money supply and the money demand and the money supply, and the way it works, all the interest rates that are important in this economy, and the rate of refinancing, the instruments, the macroeconomic policy instruments, inflation targeting, and and things like that. So these are the very important questions which are going to be discussed in this series of lectures, and in particular in this first lecture, in this lecture 1. Central banks are at the heart of any nation's economy. They govern the monetary supply. They determine the amount of money they produce, they issue into the economy, and they set some principles for the economy. They set the idea about how to deal with various financial difficulties. They are really focusing on the inflation targeting, and they are really understand the way they work, and they really are suggesting the macroeconomic policy. They control inflation. The control of inflation is one of the most important things in the economy, because inflation, in particular hyperinflation, the galloping inflation, 20% a year and 50% on a monthly basis for the hyperinflation, are destroying the economy, and it would cause really difficult financial and socio-economic problems for the economy. And if that is allowed in an economy, then the way it is done really harms the financial system, it really harms the population of this country, and it really does change the economic situation for the worse. The worst economic situations are really made by inflation and things like that. So the role of central bank in that issue is really important. Virtually all countries in the world have a central bank. What is the mission of a nation's central bank? First of all, macroeconomic stability. Like I said, all central banks in the world, and there are at least there are more than 100 central banks around the world. Like I said, there are almost in any countries there is a central bank in any country, and we've got that actually any independent state has its own currency, and as I know, at least 160 currencies circulate around the world, and more than billions of banknotes are circulating actually in the world economy. And these banknotes are issued, are printed out, produced by central banks, and the treasury of those coins, banknotes, and things like that. This is the monetary supply. And they, of course, the central banks, are doing the most important thing in the economy, what they do, macroeconomic stability, and this macroeconomic stability is the way it works, because they do a lot of monetary policy issues. They introduce special policies to hold inflation in specific brackets, so to speak, in a specific range of inflation targeting, which is really a difficult issue, because over the years, and we are going to find out that this is going to be a sort of an issue for us in the next few lectures, we're going to understand that some of the things which are going to be discussed in these lectures are going to deal with macroeconomic stability, inflation targeting, things like that. They control the output, and they control the production of goods and services by the way of interest rates. The rate of refinancing is one of the most important monetary policy instruments because this rate, the rate of refinancing, actually sets the level of the amount of loans that could be given to any company, to any enterprise in the economy, and these enterprises are going to work using that specific money, the money supply. And if this rate of refinancing is high, then entrepreneurs really do not take much credit. They do not take loans. They do not hold those. They are really careful about doing that, actually. And if they do not take loans, if they do not do this, then that would mean they would they would lay out the workers, which means unemployment in the economy. They are going to produce less, which means that there's going to be less products in the economy. And this would lead to another wave of inflation and maybe even hyperinflation, which is, like I said, the most serious problem in the economy, hyperinflation, because it steals value of the money and it steals the value of your savings. It actually robs you. Great things which are done and which were done in the past, they were introduced in those days, these ideas, and they set the amount of goods and services. They control financial panics, and they are doing the most important job of theirs is to control and observe the situation in the financial markets. Importantly, they try to prevent or mitigate financial panics or crises. The next thing we're going to discuss is the policy tools of central banks. And there are actually two of them, monetary policy and provision of liquidity. Monetary policy stands for macroeconomic stability. In normal times, what actually does it mean, normal times? Normal times means that the economy is working well, it's functioning at a really moderate rate of growth, actually, which is also important. The rate of the production growth is normal. It can be really stable. The normal economic growth can be, so to speak, could vary between 2 or 3% a year. This is the GDP growth, and the way it does its work is the way it usually gets the economy. It turns on the economy. The entrepreneurs and enterprises are working really good. In these specific times, everything is okay. The production of goods and services is really stable. They produce specific amounts of commodities and things like that. They actually do all the things that in normal times people do. So, no crisis, no specific serious economic downturns. The economic stability and financial stability is ensured. The financial markets are working good, and these financial markets are quite at work. They perform specific tasks. Then, of course, corporations are doing a great job on the financial market. They issue the shares and their bonds onto the financial market, and they borrow money at moderate rates, the moderate rate of refinancing, which is usually normal times. It is really it is not so high, it's not so big, something like 2 to 4%. In Russia it is really higher because Russia is a specific economy and many of the economic laws do not work here, like in the United States or any other great nation with the market economy, like Great Britain, Germany, and the United States of America. Countries such as these usually have a really low rates of refinancing, or the short-term rate of refinancing. The production and employment and inflation, spending, saving, these macroeconomic issues are stable in normal times. And the job of a central bank in these times is to control these issues. And they do a great job in providing liquidity. They may introduce some policy matters to increase the supply of money in the economy, because if you increase the supply of money, that means there is more loans, more credit, and this way the economy works in normal times when there is no crisis. And then, of course, they provide liquidity. This is done for the financial stability. The money supply, or the supply of money in an economy, should also be stable. You cannot print money all the time. This is really dangerous for the economy. The more you print money, the more there is the possibility for inflation. And inflation is usually a thing which, like I said, damages the economic activity. People do not want to work because they do not want to receive much salary. They should pay higher taxes because government in these times, when inflation is high, then government strives to increase taxes in order to be able to cover their debts, to cover the government's spending and things like that. And sometimes they're starting to print money like crazy, and this way the financial system actually is being damaged, and it is really a difficult and really serious issue. Central banks provide liquidity. This is called short-term loans to financial institutions or markets to help calm financial crises, panics, and they serve as the lender of last resort. And of course, the policy, a final policy tool of central banks, which is financial regulation and supervision. Supervision means control. When you supervise the economy, you set some policy tools to do that. And many central banks, including the Federal Reserve System, supervise financial institutions. What kind of institutions can we include in the category of financial institutions? Well, they are actually commercial banks, insurance corporations, mutual funds, pension funds, ETFs, exchange traded funds, and brokers, dealers, dealerships, and the financial markets. They can also be counted as some sort of financial institutions, and specifically they are members of the exchanges, and the exchanges themselves, the securities markets, the bond market is also a financial institution. It can be regarded as a infrastructure, the infrastructure of any financial system of any country in the world, because any country and each and every country in the world cannot exist without a financial system, without the monetary supply. You should do a lot of control. You should discover ways that can be understood as practical, and these practical things are done by the central banks, because they are government institutions. Also, like they are government institutions and not private corporations, like I said at the beginning of this lecture. They just try to keep firms healthy. They try to mitigate the risks, the financial risks of each and every enterprise. They are doing a great job in creating macroeconomic stability. They do not want you to separate from the economy. They do not want you to get away from the control of some of the important issues and some of the very important things in the country. They actually do a great job in controlling an overall financial situation in the economy, which is really healthy and good for any government enterprise. In the United States, the saying goes, some say that the central bank is a private corporation in the United States, because government, the United States government actually does not control the majority of shares in this system. It is independent, and in some way it can be called a private corporation, because this system belongs to private banks and private institutions, and these banks are spread all over the country, and they control the financial system of this country. So this organization is really controlled by the private capital, by private people. The largest bankers in the United States, the governors of the largest banks in this country, they are behind the policy creation. But I think this is not, sometimes it cannot be considered really true, because provided cash opportunities, and they dealt with the monetary policy the way they usually did it. And the organization itself, the Reichsbank of the German Empire in those days, was organized It was based on the principle of share ownership. So they had very important personages, bankers, and like shareholders, they controlled their stakes in this bank, and this is the way it was organized. And the same way they organized the Federal Reserve System in the United States. To the extent that supervision helps keep firms financially healthy, the risk of loss of confidence by the public and an ensuing panic is reduced. The origins of central banking. This is really a historical part of this lecture. We're going to try to list a few central banks which were created in the past. And the first central banks started in Sweden and Great Britain. These are two countries which were at the forefront of globalization in the 17th century. They introduced banks that could control the monetary supply. Great Britain, and this is understandable, this is quite understandable for them to set up a central bank, because this country was the largest trading empire in those days. And the central bank in the United Kingdom was created back in 1694. In Sweden it is even earlier, 1668, and in France 1800. Of course, these years, in those days, the Bank of England could not be considered totally a central bank, because it did not do the function of a modern central bank. For example, today in the United States, it does not perform it did not perform the functions of the contemporary Federal Reserve System. What it did was they started actually as private institutions, and in many countries the earlier central banking system was based on this. They were quite good at doing their job as private banks, because they were the largest banks in the country. They held accounts that could be traded between commercial partners. Like I said, Great Britain was a trading empire in those days, in the 17th and 18th century. And entrepreneurs needed cash to do their trading with other economies, with other nations in the world. Great Britain started its trading activities back in those days, and it became a real empire, a real trading empire, because banks, commercial banks, provided liquidity. They provided investment opportunities for ships, for sailing companies, shipment companies. They traded in slaves, they traded in many goods, and they organized the earlier system. The International Division of Labor was created in those days. Great Britain was really good at producing manufactured goods. no country in the world was really so developed, was really so entrepreneurial in its culture, like Great Britain. The entrepreneurial spirit of this nation started also in those days, in the 17th and 18th centuries. And but for the banks, but for the commercial banks, you could not say that these people, these entrepreneurs, these companies, they actually could not do without these great banks, these large banks. And of course, in the Sweden is also a country which was in those days really a great power. Russia was not was not really a competitor to Sweden, and this is understandable. And Peter the Great was the first Russian Tsar. He defeated the army of Sweden, but that was in the early 18th century. And they started their central banking practices much earlier. And in Russia, of course, there was no central bank. The Russian system of government institutions was not so developed like in the United Kingdom or in Sweden, and the economic development of our country was really slow. And only it all started with Peter the Great. He introduced some changes in the monetary and financial system, but this cannot be compared in any way to financial and monetary systems in Sweden and in Great Britain. In the 19th century, central banks also began to serve as the lender of last resort during financial panics. Financial panics. What are the financial panics? What is it actually? Well, if you watched a movie called It's a Wonderful Life, back to 1936, back to the early 20th century, where there was no central bank, and people wanted to buy homes, and there was this strife of people to own their own home in those days. And in this movie, It's a Wonderful Life, some bankers set up a business, a brokerage company, or a pool of money, and that investment pool was considered to be a financial organization, a financial institution that helped people own their own home. How can we describe a financial panic? Well, financial panics usually start with the loss of confidence of people towards the bankers, towards banks. And if there's rumors that some sort of commercial bank is going to collapse, then the next thing you would do is go to that bank and try to get your money back from the accounts of this, from your personal account in this bank. And if there are too many people to demand their cash back, and they queue in front of your financial institution, in front of your bank, that would mean a bankruptcy. This bank is going to collapse. This financial institution is going to go bankrupt. It's called sometimes also bank runs. So people run on the banks to withdraw their cash. And there are actually no bank in the financial system, in the monetary system, holds that much money, holds that much cash in its vaults, because all the money of a commercial bank is used to make investments in various financial products, such as loans, usually long-term loans. They invest in government papers, they invest money in government debt. Of course, the, central banks cannot do that. They, actually, central banks do that issue. They buy government bonds, but they cannot buy whole corporations. And banks, commercial banks, also cannot buy whole corporations. This is actually forbidden by the law in any normal state, in any country. In the United States it is prohibited. A commercial bank cannot purchase a company. So for instance, JP Morgan Chase cannot buy Gazprom, even if it has money to do that. They are not allowed into the primary financial market. They cannot go to the primary financial market, or stock market, the primary market, where shares are traded, and it cannot buy these shares. It is prohibited. It can only go onto a secondary market and buy some derivatives, and this is the issue. If he does not have any money left, that would mean a bankruptcy of his banking corporation. And but this doesn't happen in this movie, because many American movies end happily, and you may have difficulties in these movies, but in the end everything goes okay, and he persuades the people, his clients, to withhold a certain amount of money from their accounts. Not he just makes them understand that if they withdraw all the money, then all the people in this bank are going to suffer the same thing. They're going to go bankrupt. They're not going to have money, and they're not going to purchase homes. The thing which is actually the target of this banking corporation is try to help these people get their own homes. And if they all take their cash, withdraw their cash, if they do that, that would mean a certain crash for those people. So it's really important not to do that, and he persuaded them not to do that, and actually he kept his company. By the end of the day, by 6 p.m. he had $2 left, but it did not mean a bankruptcy. So he had $2 left, and this was a salvation for his banking corporation. Panics can cause widespread bank runs, like I said, restrictions on depositors' access to their funds, bank failures, the stock market crashes, economic contractions. This photograph shows a queue of people, and they are, I think it's in New York. This is one of the largest banks in New York, and financial panic is possible in any situation where long-term liquid assets are financed by short-term liquid liabilities. It is time when short-term lenders or depositors lose confidence in their banks, and they start demanding the money back, like I said. And there were many such crises in the past. They really were frequent in the early 20th century and the end of the 19th century as well. And there were really widespread bank runs. For instance, one of the largest banking panics, financial panics in those days, was the banking crisis of 1907. And in that particular year, 500 banks went bankrupt, they collapsed, and they just the whole financial system of the United States could go bankrupt. Some banks, of course, the most important, the largest banks, stayed afloat, and they tried to do the job of the lender of last resort. Some of the banks commercial banks could go over to those clearing houses, so to speak, and those clearing houses, like the New York Banking Corporation, it could give some money, it could give some cash to struggling banks, to struggling commercial banks, and this bank, the largest bank in the country, could save the economy from collapsing because it helped some very important banks. But there arises a very serious issue: whom to support. What kind of banks are going to be supported by these clearinghouse, by the largest bank in the country? And for example, if one entrepreneur wants to avenge some of his activities and wants to crush, to destroy his competitor, he would not give money to him. He would not give money to his competitor. And if he comes to his banker and tells him, "I need some cash in order to be able not to, so that my bank cannot go bankrupt," he would say, he would not say that I'm your competitor and I'm not going to give you some loans, but I quietly withdraw the market. I'm neutral in this situation, and I say I do not have much cash to provide you with these loans, and that bank goes bankrupt. And in that way, 500 banks collapsed in 1907. So this is a situation, and it is possible, and in this situation, short-term lenders or depositors may lose confidence in the financial institutions they are financing, or become worried that others may lose confidence as well. What is a lender of last resort function? This is a very important function of any central bank, because it is a function that helps the banks, the commercial banks, stay afloat. For example, if a bank has financial difficulties, if it is struggling, a central bank could serve its function as lender of last resort. This financial institution, this bank, can go over to the central bank and ask for some money. And this way, it keeps the financial institution afloat. What does it do as a lender of last resort? The central bank does not give you cash for nothing, of course, because your bank may go bankrupt even if the central bank provides you with cash. Central banks provide cash only to those struggling commercial banks that could be held afloat after they give these loans. For instance, and the issue they audit the financial situation, the overall financial situation of a bank, the commercial bank, and if they understand that there are some really good long-term assets which can be purchased, which can be provided as collateral, then the issue is the central bank takes those good long-term assets and gives a commercial bank cash in order to help it stay afloat. Commercial banks, like I said previously, do not hold much cash in their vaults. This is really impractical. They've got two kinds of reserves. They've got excessive reserves and required reserves. Of course, excessive reserves are much larger than the required reserves. Usually commercial banks give out up to 96% of their money to the financial markets, to the population, as loans to enterprises, to firms, corporations, other foreign corporations maybe, and things like that. So they do not hold much cash in their vaults, and if they do that, of course they should concentrate on keeping in mind that they can go bankrupt. Of course, they should think about that as well. So for that not to happen, they should keep money in a central bank on an interest-free account in a central bank. And in the case when people demand the money back, a central bank could give that money to a commercial bank. And sometimes they really do that. And this is called the last resort, the lender of last resort function. So the central bank buys or purchases long-term assets of any commercial bank, and it gives instead cash. And this cash is going to be provided for the population for their general use. And if people are satisfied with that, if their demand is satisfied, then nothing serious is going to happen. And after some times, when the situation normalizes, when there is no more financial panic, and people start going back to their commercial banks, again they put their money back in their accounts in those banks, the situation normalizes, and this commercial bank tries to get their money back, their long-term loans from the central bank or any other financial institution of government importance. An economist who really did a great job in providing theoretical basis for the central banking in Great Britain and actually in Europe was Walter Bagehot. You can see you can see when he was born. He was born on the February 3rd, 1826, and he died on March 24th, 1877. He was a really great economist. He was actually a journalist. He was the author of a book called Lombard Street, 1873. Today we can find a column in The Economist newspaper, The Economist magazine, the British magazine, and we can find a column called by his name. This column is called Budget or something. Yeah, I think Budget is it's called. And they still use this column. They understand how things work in the economy by reading some articles, some specific articles in this magazine. So what he did, what he introduced, his idea was that he should provide cash to the banks in hard times and try to control their activities in normal times. So lend freely in hard times, give them cash, but demand good collateral. Good collateral means good long-term assets. They are liquid. They're not so liquid as cash, but still they're good, and they can bring you money in the future. Because sometimes these long-term loans are fixed income bonds, fixed income government bonds, things like that, and they serve as a collateral in this situation. So this is the basis on which and every financial institution works, and this is the way they do their central banking practices. So you provide cash freely to those banks, and they do a great job in doing that. He was a British economist, a British journalist, and he recommended this thing to commercial banks and, of course, a central bank. Like I said, in Great Britain there was a central bank which is still in existence, and this is the Bank of England. And he recommended the Bank of England to lend freely in hard times, and in normal times just control the situation by increasing or decreasing the monetary supply in an economy. And there is, of course, a penalty interest rate, and if you take that interest rate, that means that it does not mean that it punishes you. Central bank does not punish you. It wants some financial guarantee that after the financial crisis or financial panics, the financial panic or run in your bank stops and the situation normalizes and things come back to normal, they would just withhold their long-term, they would repay to the central bank and start a new business, for instance. They would go over to the financials, they would return to the financial market. They would do a really a good job in providing cash for those who needs it, like population, general population, other banks, other corporations, things like that. So, at a penalty interest rate, they discourage excessive use of cash. They discourage excessive use of other financial opportunities. And if we ask the question, how does Bagehot's dictum help stem financial panics? Well, he said, this journalist said actually, that during a financial panic, financial firms need to pay off depositors and other short-term lenders. And long-term debt stays the same. And they use it as collateral, they give it to a central bank, and central bank provides them with cash opportunities, provides them with liquidity. And this liquidity is used in order to help these banks stay afloat. But long-term assets of these banks are going to be taken as collateral by the central bank, as a guarantee that issued, so that a central bank could be assured about your credit worthiness, so to speak. The credit worthiness actually is a situation when your bank is a payable institution. You have cash opportunities, you've got cash in your vaults, and you get really important financial assets that could be used as collateral. But if you just take these long-term assets, these long-term loans, immediately, and you demand them as so if you do not want the central bank to intervene with your business, if you want to handle the situation personally or individually, and you want to keep those long-term assets in your vaults, that would mean that you're going to sell those long-term shares, those long-term assets at really low prices. So this deal is going to cost you dearly, because when you are struggling with a financial panic, when there's a run on your bank, that means that you're going to use your long-term assets as a collateral, you're going to use those. If you're going to sell those long-term assets, that would mean you would sell them really cheap. And this way, we should not be doing this. This is a poor way of dealing with any financial crisis, of any financial problem. We should actually be concerned about financial institutions, the financial banks, financial institutions actually, commercial banks, as sort of institutions that are responsible for their actions. Many firms actually might go bankrupt, and when we take this example as a general rule, if financial firms can borrow freely from the central bank using their assets as collateral, they pay off depositors, they avert fire sales. This is what I was trying to make you understand. Fire sales. It means that you sell your long-term assets at fire sale prices, very cheap. But in good times and normal times, these long-term assets can be really expensive. So do not do that. Commercial banks should not do this. And this is really important as an issue for us to discover in this lecture. if you're trying to sell those long-term assets at fire sale prices, then investors start to think that your institution is weak and it may go bankrupt, and they are afraid of purchasing your long-term assets. That is when a central bank should come, when a central bank should really interfere with this situation, and it should be confident about these financial long-term assets. And they are usually do a great job in keeping financial institutions afloat that way. So they avert fire sales of their assets and restore the confidence of their depositors. The origins of the Federal Reserve System. The first issue which we're going to study is financial stability concerns, financial stability issues. Well, after Civil War is something like the 1860s, it was in the early 1860s. After the Civil War and the early 1900s, some financial stability functions were provided by private organizations, banks, and other financial institutions. Well, one of the very notable, the largest financial institution in the United States, or at least one of the largest, was called the New York Clearing House. And today, this New York Clearing House, it's actually the New York Reserve Bank, the New York Banking Corporation. And this institution is still in existence. It is really an important financial institution in the United States, and it provided cash. It supplied entrepreneurs with cash in hard times. And in normal times, so what they actually did was these commercial banks working with this clearinghouse, and they had their partners, and these partners met at the New York Clearinghouse, and they exchanged their assets, actually, their warrants, their commercial paper. They exchanged it, they cleared it in this bank, and this bank was a sort of an institution that you were confident in, and this was the place, a starting place for the central banking system of the United States.